stick to this very quick.
I am.
That, of course, is seen a few weeks back in D.C. as a woman rammed the White House security gate, then led police in a chase through the federal district. But the video, it raised a whole host of questions like, why didn't police open fire sooner or shoot the tires? That's just one of several police-related questions that have got a whole lot of folks asking questions about what is and isn't police procedures lately. And I had a host of them, so we figured let's bring in an expert and hear what some of the answers is. Joe Giacalone, a former NYPD detective sergeant, now author and professor in law, police science, and criminal justice administration at John Jay College, which is just about the best place if you want to have a career in law enforcement to go. Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Let's first get into the Capitol shooting and then go forward. Maybe it's because we watched too many police serial dramas on TV, but a lot of people said, why didn't they just shoot out the tires? And if they didn't see a gun, when is it procedure and policy to open fire on the car, and when isn't it? It seemed like it was more justified to open it earlier than later.
Well, in a situation like we have here, you always try to isolate and contain, but because you have something that either occurs on a street or a moving vehicle, it's very difficult to isolate it. And you got to remember, there's people standing around, there are innocent people. Shooting out the tires, probably not your best option, because if it ricochets, if you miss, hits off the cement and hits somebody else in the leg or somewhere, God forbid, you might kill somebody that way. Never a good idea. And, the public has to understand that it's not, the use of force in policing is not based on what their perception is, but the perception of that individual officer.
Who makes the call? Like in that situation, do you wait for a sergeant or superior to say, green light the use of fire? Or if you're an officer on the ground, are you allowed to make that discretionary call on a split-second basis?
Each officer is trained to make that discretionary. This is something where nobody wants to go through it. Nobody wants to have to use deadly physical force, but it does happen. But each individual officer is going to make that decision, and sometimes it's a split second.
The location also, I think, factored into that. It was near the White House and the Capitol. Let's say it's New York and it's City Hall or it's the World Trade Center site. Are there different rules about different locations and how sensitive we might be to a
No,
you'd
never find like a different procedure to handle if you have a more a place like the World Trade Center or something like that. That would never happen. Every situation is handled pretty much the same way. But I would think that it would heighten the officer's security level on that report.
So.
Yep. So I think and unfortunately you don't know what the intention is of this person.
Well, let me get to the next one because, and I want to preface this by saying, and any of us who have friends who are on the job, it's a tough job. And it's easy to sit back here in a nice cushy studio and Monday morning quarterback it. All that said though, it was hard when we were trying to figure out, well, what's the policy and what isn't? You get different answers sometimes. So let's use the Times Square shooting. About a month ago, cops approached an emotionally disturbed man in Times Square trying to be hit by cars. Now, he was simulating shooting with his hand. Cops opened fire 3 times. They missed the guy. Each time, they hit 2 women, one in the backside and one in the leg. Now, they recovered, but a couple questions came out of this. Do you have to see gun to fire? And 2, Joe, is what is the discretionary call when you got innocent civilians around? Again, you didn't hit the guy. You hit the 2 civilians that were there doing nothing but just standing in Times Square.
Right. This is something where total nightmare, especially in New York City where there's so many people laying around. The threat of having a gun in the middle of the street on, right by the bus terminal, and the officer has to make that decision right then and there. Do I have to fire?
Do you have to see gun though?
Well,
to say fire or no?
Not necessarily, because apparently he makes this furtive movement that he has a gun, or maybe somebody in the crowd yells he's got a gun. Remember that officer's fear is now heightened, and it doesn't really take that much at that point. Now, I understand a lot of people say, well, this is what you get paid to do. And like you said, it's easy to come back and look at these things. I mean, I've been involved in a police-involved shooting, and I can tell you from experience that it is one of those things where you don't remember a lot that's happening.
Adrenaline,
yeah, your fear of your life. I mean, there's no special place, there's no planet cop that we get cops from. They're human beings. They also are prone to make mistakes. I'm not saying that they made a mistake in this one, but, that decision call at that point, those officers felt that was the thing they needed to do to terminate the threat. And in New York City, you also have this thing where people like to sit around and watch what's going on instead of, protecting themselves or concealing themselves or covering.
But you have to factor that in before you pull the trigger, right? You had all these civilians standing around, and whether they should or shouldn't be, they're right in the line of fire. That
Right.
that in training, I assume, comes into it,
Well,
right? You're trying to get the guy in a more secure environment before you exchange fire.
Yeah, you try to have cover and concealment as the police. And if you try to have to, if you have to retreat, you can do that also. Retreat's not a dirty word. However, the threat to the public could have been greater than that these officers felt that if they would have just left this guy alone in the street. Because could you imagine if they didn't do this and this guy did have a gun, he started shooting innocent bystanders or stabbing them or something like that. So you're in that catch-22 at that point where, if you don't do something, you're going to be, questioned. And if you do something, you'll be questioned.
What about tasers or something less potentially lethal? Are they accessible? Does every officer have them? Is there one for every so many officers out there?
In New York City, for patrol officers, the patrol officers don't have a taser. Only the patrol sergeant does. That's covering it. And there could be, it depends on how big the precinct is, there could be a couple of patrol sergeants out there. An emergency service unit has the capability too. There's always the question about, if we have tasers, would this been prevented? It's like everything else. Too many tasers and too many different things, you could also fall into a situation where you might have overuse of it. From being, a police officer and being a sergeant in these types of situations, the sergeant responds to all types of we call them jobs.
Okay.
Where there's anything with weapons or there's a threat of force.
Anybody who's been in Times Square, even now that it's Disney World, knows you got nuts on every corner. Okay.
Even Elmo's nuts.
Yeah. And I'm curious. You get there, you're not sure there's a gun, right? And I grant you, now you put yourself in this situation. Does the training say they ask the guy, show us hands here, before you fire? Do you have to give a warning of any kind? Do you shoot for center mass? Give the training before somebody comes out of the academy and then they walk on it. What does the training say they're supposed to do when you see somebody doing, he's obviously not well. He's trying to weave in and out of traffic, trying to get hit by cars here. So obviously the guy's not right. What are they supposed to do if they've got a troubled guy in front of them?
Well, the famous lines, police don't move, is one of those things that they train you in the academy. That's the first things you should try to say. But sometimes it's contradictory, right? Because it's police don't move, let me see your hands. So, it's like it's kind of contradictory. So what you do here is the training goes pretty simple. Let me see your hands, because your hands are the most dangerous things, because that's where you can hold a weapon, knife, gun, whatever it may be. So if I can see your hands, I feel more comfortable approaching this person. This is something that a lot of the general public doesn't understand too. That doesn't mean he doesn't have a gun or anything in his waistband or in his pocket or a knife. He doesn't know the intention of this person. So you're trained to let me see your hands, don't move. Turn around, even maybe lift up your jacket so I can look at your waistband, because that's where generally most people will keep a weapon. But this person here might not have been in their right mind. So those commands weren't going through. And you can't sit there all day going, police don't move, police don't move.
When you'll always hear, we talked about the last incident in D.C., why not shoot the tires instead of shooting through the windshield? In this particular case, if you're not sure, do you shoot for a leg or anything? Again, do you always aim center mass at the person?
Yes, the police departments are trained to stop. And center mass, the reason why they pull center mass is only because that's the biggest area of your body. Trying to hit somebody in their big toe or their leg or whatever it may be, or shoot the gun out of their hand is just not a possibility. And it happens on TV, right? They shoot the gun out of the person's hand. That's far from reality.
Dominic does it all the time in the green room. All right, now this last one here, and I don't think there's too much debate. The tragedy that happened in Charlotte, North Carolina a month ago. Overnight car crash. Man wanders from the car and he rings a doorbell. Homeowner panics, middle of the night, sees a black guy outside of her door. She all of a sudden hits her alarm and she calls 911. The cops show up and it leads to a tragedy.
As the officers approach him just to determine if in fact he is the individual, what's going on, he just immediately takes off and runs toward a particular officer, and that officer attempted to retreat, but at the same time fired his weapon.
Okay, a few questions in this. There wasn't a weapon. There was a bunch of cops that were there. And he didn't just fire his weapon. As I understood it, I think he fired 8 to 10 times. I forget the total number of shots that were fired. The guy was immediately suspended, and I think the police, with the exception of that press conference that happened, I guess, in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, they took the officer to task. What should have happened and shouldn't happen here? When the public says, wait a second, people get nervous when they see the police too or whatever, that shouldn't be a death sentence. Do they have a point?
Yes and no. Yes, because, as the general public, we expect the police to protect us and not make mistakes. But they're prone to making mistakes. Now, this is a terrible tragedy, and nobody would ever want to be responsible for the death of somebody who was totally innocent. And in this situation, the officer felt that, why is this guy charging at me? And decided that the threat was that this guy was after me. Because you got to remember something. Every time the police show up, it's a man with a gun call, because the cop has the gun. And most cops, where they are shot, they're actually shot with their own weapon many times. And that's why the bullet-resistant vest that they wear is meant to stop the size of the round that they are carrying. So this is something where he must have felt that if I don't stop this threat right now, if this guy's gonna, if it might be much bigger than he was, if he tackles me, takes my gun, this could be a
It doesn't matter if he's
tragedy.
not the only cop on the scene. I mean, he's got other guys with him. The guy's running at him. Worst case, he loses a wrestling match, but he's got his guys there with him. It's not a life or death incident is my point. I understand if the guy pulled a gun from the front door, we're having a different conversation. But do you have to see gun to shoot gun?
Well, generally it's deadly physical force for deadly physical force. That's basically what you have. However, if you can articulate that the fear and the situation at hand, apparently this officer wasn't able to do that with his department by suspending him. The issue that really comes down to is that, a lot of times the public wants to look at these things and point fingers, and you have to really take it from, what happens if it was me, where somebody came charging at me? What would I do?
But would it be different, let's be honest, right? If you or I knocked on the door that midnight versus Dominic knocking on the door. And I think that also played into this conversation, where the chance of, there's a lot of factors that go into it, right? Lady might have gotten freaked out. White neighborhood, a black guy's knocking on her door because he had a car accident. She didn't know, right? Cops come because a panicked woman's on the call. And now all of a sudden the guy's big crime was he had a car accident, was looking for help, and he runs when he sees people with guns, and all of a sudden he's dead. I guess the question is, what should the public expect? Mistakes can be made, but when they're deadly mistakes, should there be accountability with punishment when the cops make a deadly mistake?
Well, eventually, I think administratively, at the very least, this officer is going to lose his job. I mean,
and you think he should?
Well,
from the facts we know,
from the facts we know, if this officer did act out of that he really made a terrible mistake, then at the very least, he will be fired. And I think that would be the right course of action. The issue that comes down to is
he was arrested within 24 hours.
Yep.
Within 24 hours of the incident.
They did a pretty good job investigating this. They will also have to look at their training methods about different use of force, like when you can pull out the gun. See, there's no rules about when the cop can pull out his gun.
And that's what I'm getting, and I think maybe the audience is too, Joe, which is, as much as we'd like to be, if A happens, do B. If C happens, do D. In reality, and we've seen so many stories, we don't have time to get into them all, it's an instinctive judgment call at that point, and while there may be training and stuff, it's very discretionary on the part of the officer, isn't it?
It certainly is. There's no rules about when the officer can take out his gun. Like, they don't say, well, you can have to have one from column A and one from column B in order to be able to pull out your gun. This is something that, like I said, you don't want to have to be in this position to do it. But remember, your life is at stake. Maybe you're going to take your gun out. That's the only way to prevent that from happening. And the officers will have.
But you guys must do at John Jay actual case studies where you talk about, in this tragedy, in this situation, this is what we should have done instead, right? Instead of firing 41 shots on the stoop in Brooklyn, right? We should have done X instead. What is the most common? What's the thing that you try and drive home, especially in the last 10 years, to potential recruits, cadets, officers that maybe you didn't 20, 30 years ago?
When the opportunity for cover or concealment is there, take it and let the situation play out. Because once you're behind something like an engine block of a car or a stoop, you have that extra couple of seconds to be able to react to something where, if you're out in the open, you wouldn't have that opportunity.
Joe, thank you so much. And again, the book is The Criminal Investigative Function, and Joe Giacalone here. Okay, everybody. When we come back, we're going to ask Joe to stay with us. We're going to be talking about an issue that we discussed last night, which was guns, the tragedy that happened at the Nevada school. They have an update on that, and another similar but yet tragedy again of a gun falling in the wrong hands in someone's home. Stay with us.